In this video, we're going to be learning about the historical context that led Charles Darwin to develop his hypotheses that he eventually combined into his most famous work on the origin of species. Now, this hypothesis was penned while Darwin was traveling to a very famous group of islands, which are what we call the Galapagos Archipelago, located off the western coast of South America. Now, the Galapagos Archipelago is a very useful location for evolutionary biologists to study simply because of its geographic isolation. Simply put, the islands are significantly far away enough from the South American mainland that it makes it very difficult for organisms to actually travel to the islands and enter the ecosystem, simply because organisms would either need to be flyers like birds or would need to somehow be carried there across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. This also makes it very difficult for organisms to leave the islands as well, which means that the populations of organisms are relatively cut off from the South American mainland. Now, obviously, because the islands are relatively small, this means that the available resources for all of the organisms on the island are relatively limited as well. This includes food, fresh water, and living space, of course, and even though water might seem like a little bit of a surprise, remember that these islands are surrounded by ocean water, which isn't drinkable for the majority of terrestrial organisms. Now, because the populations of organisms on each of the islands are relatively limited as well, this means that each population has a limited number of sexual partners for the purpose of reproduction. Now, what this means is that organisms that are effectively trapped on these islands must compete with each other for limited resources. For example, competing with each other for food, water, and living space simply for being able to survive, and also compete with each other among members of their own population for the limited number of mates for the ability to reproduce. Now, based on this limiting of resources, Darwin came to the conclusion that organisms that inherited very poor adaptations, meaning organisms that are less well adapted to this environment, either will not survive long enough or therefore will not be able to track down a suitable mate in order to reproduce. In other words, the limited resources of the islands themselves determined which members of a population were well adapted enough and which were not, and therefore were not able to survive. And this is where the term natural selection comes from, in that it is not the characteristics of the organisms themselves that varies so much as it is the resources of nature itself, and that nature ultimately is the selection pressure that determines who survives and reproduces and who does not. And the organism populations that Darwin studied were a species of birds, or not so much a single species of birds, but multiple species of birds that are what we call finches. And these particular finches all shared relatively similar characteristics, even if each of them was distinctly identifiable, suggesting to Darwin that these finches shared a common ancestor from the South American mainland, whose ancestral population migrated to the Galapagos Islands. Now, what Darwin observed is that even though it was fairly obvious that these finches long, long ago, many generations ago, were originally the same population, hundreds, if not thousands of years of competing with each other led to the formation of many different species. The most notable physical difference between all of them is that each species of finch had a differently shaped beak, meaning that each species of finch is better or worse adapted towards being able to find a specific food source. And this is where the term adaptations was originally coined, or at least in regard to structural adaptations here. So because the beak is clearly part of the finch's morphology, this means that it is indeed a structural adaptation. Now, what Darwin was able to conclude from this simple observation is that because each species of finch has a different beak that makes it better adapted towards finding a specific food source, this means that each different species of finch does not actually directly compete with each other, but instead each individual population is better adapted towards finding a specific food source, and therefore, without this competition, each individual population is more likely to be able to find food and therefore survive, thereby giving the specific population of finch with the most ideal beak suited towards finding a specific food source an advantage over other populations that were less well adapted in order to compete for this specific food source. In the next video, what we're going to look at is how Darwin used this original observation and the conclusion that he reached in order to come to an understanding about how populations change over multiple generations, which led to the establishment of the groundwork for our modern understanding of how evolution works. So join us in the next video where we discuss the actual process and mechanism behind natural selection.